So in today's lesson, we're going to continue to talk about the scientific method. So far, we've talked about making good questions, developing hypotheses, and also looking at how to construct a procedure. But today we're going to focus on observations. So let's first chat about procedure. We did a little activity last week where you had to use blocks and build a block and then develop a procedure so that somebody else could replicate that. And I'm hoping that you were able to learn about what might make a good procedure. So think on that for a minute. What might make a good procedure? So I'm hoping that you thought that the instructions had to be really clear and pretty specific in order for a person to replicate your procedure. That there needed to be enough detail so that you could use the detail to help follow through on the procedure. And lastly, it just needs to be easily able to be followed by somebody else. So those are just some of the ideas. Maybe you thought of different things, but these are some of the things that came to my mind. And so today, in talking about observations, we're going to differentiate between what is an observation versus what is an inference. And there's definitely some overlap there. And so on your worksheet, I want you to take a look and find this Venn diagram so that as we watch the next video, you can start to fill in, well, what are some things that are observations? What is an observation and how is it different than an inference? Okay, so next I want to talk to you about qualitative observations. So some qualitative observations are going to be, well, do you remember what those are? You should have your worksheet in front of you and be able to fill in as we go. So qualitative observations are observations that can be gathered through our senses. Okay, they describe the qualities of an object and events. And sometimes that might include a diagram that describes, but you're going to be using usually your sense of sight and your sense of smell typically more commonly to describe something qualitatively. Okay, you can't measure a qualitative observation. So for example, if something is red, we can't measure red in the way that we might be able to measure a distance, for instance. Okay, so a great set of qualitative observations would be to describe the color, the odor, maybe the taste, not so much in science, and maybe the luster of an object. So example, if you're looking at a rose, you might say the rose is red and it has a sweet smell. And that's just one example. Now try to take a minute to think about, well, how is a quantitative observation different? Well, the word quantitative has quantity in it. So I'm hoping you remembered that this is based on measurements and possibly counting. And we're describing things precisely. So it deals with the quantity of things, right? Often you're going to take what you're measuring and put it in some sort of a table to collect your data. So we're going to be measuring it. So what are some things that we can measure? We can measure temperature, we can measure mass, we can measure distance, we can measure time, and so on and so forth. So here are some examples. So for instance, we can measure the length of a block, maybe the time it takes to run that length, right? You might measure the air temperature when you're running, or maybe the number of items. We saw that those parakeets being counted in the video. Okay, so if I were describing a rose, I might say that the rose's stem is 14 centimeters long. I've measured that. And it has 5 leaves. So maybe the rose has 5 leaves and I've counted that. So in the next activity, what we're going to do is we're going to observe a melting ice cube. Okay, so I have that on video for you. And so what I want you to do on your worksheet here is to write down as many qualitative observations and quantitative observations of the ice cube as it's melting, right? What could be some qualitative and quantitative observations that could be made? And I want you to think about a good scientific question that could relate to the ice cube being melted, and then a hypothesis or a prediction related to the ice cube and your question. So a big hint to that is, well, what variables could you change to see how that might affect the ice cube? Here we go. And so take a minute to think about what those qualitative and quantitative observations might be of that ice cube melting, and fill that in on your sheet. And once you're done that, have a conversation about what it is, with maybe a neighbor about what they thought were some good qualitative and quantitative observations about the ice cube melting. All right, so here are some qualitative observations that I thought of in case you were a little bit stuck. I might say that it looks like it is going from being a solid to a liquid, right? That is something I'm using my sense of sight to see. I might see that it goes from being rectangular to a puddle. I might say that the smell does not change. All right. So those are a few qualitative observations that I could make. Maybe you came up with some others. Maybe it goes from being cloudy to clear, right? It's cloudy when it's an ice cube, but then when it becomes a liquid, then it gets a little bit more transparent, right? Those are just some ideas. What about quantitative observations? Maybe I might talk about how the length changes, right? So I might talk about how the surface area changes from, and I might actually measure that from blah to blah. I don't know, right? I might also measure the temperature change, right? What is the ice cube's temperature initially, and what is it at the end once it's all melted, right? I might talk about the time it takes to melt, right? Those are all some observations that I could make in my list. So hopefully you had some of those and maybe even some other ideas. Okay, and so the next part was asking you to think of a scientific question that you could ask about the ice cube. So if you haven't filled this out yet, pause the video and think about what you might be able to put there. So one thing I thought about was, well, what is the effect of temperature on the time it takes for the ice cube to melt, right? That might be a question that I might ask. And then I might say, okay, well, here's my hypothesis that might go along with that. If the temperature of the room is higher, then what would happen if I increase the temperature of the room, right? Or the surroundings? Then the ice cube will take less time to melt. And why is that? Because heating provides energy to the ice cube, helping it to melt. And that's just one idea. You could have come up with entirely different hypothesis, and that might work just fine. Okay, and so now this last question is a bit of one that you have to sort of do on your own, which is, was this easier or more difficult than you expected, or why? Just write a short little comment there describing what you think about that. And I want you to just do a little self-check. After this, I feel blank about recording observations. How do I feel? Do I feel better about it? Do I feel more confused? If you're feeling more confused, then that's a great opportunity for you to reach out to ask for some clarifications, just to help you to kind of gain a better understanding about how it is that we go about recording observations. Now, one last thing before we forget. Remember this, we watched that video of the insect, and in that video, the narrator described the difference between observation and an inference. So I just want you to quickly add to your little Venn diagram here that an observation is made using your senses, right? We're going to use our senses. So what are our senses? We can look at our sense of sight, what we see. Okay, we can use our sense of smell. We can use even our sense of taste in certain situations, and even touch in certain situations. Touch. My spelling's a little off there. Let me fix that. and so on. Whereas in our inference, when we make an inference, we're actually using our brain. And often when we use our brain in these situations, we're using our past experience. Right? And so we need to be careful when when we're putting information down in an observation table about whether we're actually making an observation or we're making an inference, right? They talked about the spider, for example. So not all spiders are going to have 8 legs because some might have lost them. So we need to be careful when we make an inference about whether that inference is, or when we make an observation, whether we're using what we're seeing or what we think is happening. And that's a big difference. Okay, so I hope that helps clarify what it is that you have to do and that you're more clear on the difference between an observation and inference. As always, make sure you reach out if you need some extra help.